Okay, in this presentation, I want to now do two things. I want to provide a broad overview of the course as you've gone through it, or as some of you will be finishing it in this next week, and then prepare you for the final exam and give you kind of a sense of how to think about your grade. So I just want to remind you kind of where we started and of the proportions here, right? So the zine is really the main thing, right, that I really want you to be focusing your energy on. Um, and that will kind of help you use what you're learning in a very simple one-page letter to a judge that, again, shows me that you can use the legal reasoning. So I'm going to keep talking about the abduction worksheet. It's good for you to practice for that assignment and also for the final exam. Now, also, you'll see the final exam is only 10% of your grade. But that could, let's say you have a B, that could set you up to a B plus or a B minus, depending on, how your other work did. And if you are, let's say, a C minus, which is not a passing grade in this COVID environment for John Jay transfer, that'd bump you up to a passing grade of credit or a C or C plus. Now, the test that you took earlier, I think that should give you a good indication of how well you did the reading and what you might want to do in the final readings to make sure that you're ready to actually talk about those readings and that you're not simply copying and pasting or giving a broad opinion based on whether you agree with the reading or not. And then just to kind of also make it clear that your assignment grades, some of you have been very concerned about those. Not very many of you, just a few of you, but those are only 20% of your grade. So let's say you did the extra credit assignment, you'd be recovering from any of the problems you had if assignments were late. Now, try to keep this in mind, right? You came into this class with some ideas about the judiciary or the court system. Many of you expressed not having much knowledge about it, and that's fairly common. And so what I wanted you to do is think about, here are some ways to think about this class, right? How do judges go about making decisions? There's kind of a myth that judges just kind of make things up or that they can apply any kind of logical reasoning that they want. And that's not true, right? Judges are trained in law school. We're taught very clearly. There's something called legal canons. There's legal writing, right? There's a very specific process, and I've given you just kind of a hint at that or a snapshot of that. And so judges aren't making things up. Now, they're still human beings, right? They're not computers or robots, and so they do have feelings, right? They do have experiences that they're going to draw upon. But think about this other problem, right, is that the court system is very complicated. So hopefully in Intro to Criminal Justice, you learned about the roles and responsibilities of the court system. It's a federal system, so you've got your local courts, you've got your state courts, you've got your highest court in the state, then you've got the federal courts for federal issues, and then you've got the Supreme Court, right? That's a complicated structure, right? So different cases are going to happen at different times. There's also, by the way, there's maritime courts, there's international courts, there's a bunch of other courts that influence how judges think about issues. And all trained lawyers, including myself, we're constantly reading about, changes in the system. And so it's not a fixed system. One time I heard somebody say, the Constitution hasn't changed since 1776. I mean, first of all, the Constitution has changed numerous times since 1776, and that's the amendment process. But the interpretations of that document change with each generation, and the way it's used and thought about. And there's thousands of laws passed every year, and so how those laws interact with the Constitution also changes. So, on the one hand, judges have a specific way of thinking that they're trained how to do, and you can see this is probably the reason. On the other hand, we live in a very complex and complicated society, and so those two things are kind of always in tension with each other. So from the readings, I'm trying to get, students need to be able to make connections. If you transfer onto John Jay, or if you want to be successful in other courses, and some extent, right, being able to make these connections is helpful in your careers and probably in your personal lives. You have to take 3 or 4 different concepts and bring them into what's called synthesis, or bringing them together to make some kind of coherent phrasing. So hopefully that now you've done these readings, right, you'll see what I wrote to you earlier. This is one way of bringing these readings into organization. Now, there's other readings that I'm not referring to here because I'd like you to do it, right? I don't want you to say the same thing I did. I want you to take a few of these things and what did you notice? What did you pull out? What are things that you saw as similar or different? And again, if you look at the right-hand side here, I'm not asking you to come up with a 7-page paper, right? I'm asking you to come up with a sentence or two that really draws these readings together and that shows me that you're able to make sense of the course that way. Now, the first part of the course was all about just getting you to see that the complication of social conflicts. And then, two other ways of thinking about it. One was that, TV presents social conflicts within the context of a very, there's a structure that writers that write TV shows and movies follow, where you have character development, then you have conflict, and then you have resolution, right? And the TV shows follow that pattern. You'll notice the same thing in your English classes that focus on literature. That's not how the real world works. Of course, anybody who's ever been in a intimate relationship understands, right? Sometimes there are no resolutions, and other times, people are fighting just to fight. And so, you have to think about courts aren't going to be able to resolve every single conflict. Shows like Judge Judy, I'll show you, for example, that's not real court. That's all television, theater, and a process that's outside of the court system. So, that CSI article is just showing you that, forensics, by the way, is not, what it's portrayed to be on television. Forensics is, I took that class in law school. That's for evidence that you would present based on an expert witness used at court, in trial. And those folks tend to have PhDs or other degrees, advanced degrees. So, the forensics process is different than being a forensic analyst. But on TV, many of you, we all watch the same shows, that is not explained in any way. In some ways, Dexter, right? When Dexter goes to court, a couple of the TV shows, you see it a little bit, right? But no TV show really explains it very well. Probably because it would be dreadfully boring, to be honest, right? Nobody's like trying to watch the show for that. They're trying to watch it for the intrigue and the drama. And so again, courts are not great places to resolve social conflicts for the sake of solving social conflicts, right? They're there to try to apply law and really what's called stare decisis, or a way of thinking about law that it would apply to as many cases as possible, so that people can predict how things will happen in their regular life and what rules they choose to follow and which ones they're willing to suffer the consequences. For example, I saw a guy in the news today saying that he's going to defy the rule that he has to close his restaurant because of the snowstorm. He's saying he expects to suffer the consequences of that, right? But he thinks he'll probably make more money than he'll be fined, and we'll see, right? So I'm making a funny, joke here, but this is the thing, right? The facts you see in the media and in pop culture are not the same thing as legal facts. One of the things that students struggle with in law school for legal writing is this problem, right? They think that it's just the facts. Well, no, the facts are disputed, right? And so part of the trial court system, again, you should have learned in Intro to Criminal Justice, is trying to determine what these facts are, legally speaking, not scientifically, not religiously, not morally, but legally speaking. So there's forms that they have to fill out. There's templates. There's ways that you have to argue. And to be honest, having worked in this system, sometimes facts that to be true don't end up being in the court proceedings because of this process. So this is the main kind of takeaway. There's rules first, right? So caveat emptor means buyer beware. You bought something and it turned out not to be the thing that you thought it was, and you say, well, this isn't fair. True, it's not fair. It's terrible. Go complain. But you don't have any legal remedy because of this legal rule called buyer beware. Somebody parks somewhere and they say, well, I didn't see the sign. I didn't know you're not supposed to park. The saying, the legal rule is ignorance of the law is no excuse, right? So there's legal rules that apply to cases. So it's not facts and then opinions and then a rule. It's here's the rule. Now let's see how it applies to the facts. So again, judges are trained and they're well trained. They're very similar because they're following the similar ritual and routine. If you compare this to a sporting event or fashion or music, right? You can tell the people who are trained versus the people who are not, right? And why is that? Well, because they follow kind of a formula or a standard. Same thing with judges. Judges aren't well connected to everyday conflicts because they live very privileged lives, right? They try to pay attention. Many of them talk about, quote unquote, going out amongst the people, but they're not living in the housing authority. They're not taking the subway by and large. They're not going to small shops, right? They're not seeing, what we would call like the street level, right? How people are interacting on everyday bases. So, and that's probably good in some ways, right? Because they're supposed to apply legal rules, not how they feel or what they know about people. But they're seeing these things from an arm's length relationship, so they're not necessarily trying to fix the problem, right? They're not trying to resolve the conflict for the people. They're trying to follow a pattern of law and legal rules. So for you to practice, I provided the abduction the abduction worksheet. And then I'm hoping, right, that you'll look at the Judiciary Act and then you'll read one or all three of these cases and practice, right? Find the legal rule in each of these cases. Now, judges usually say something like, we hold, it is a well-established rule. But the hint here is when you see a paragraph that is mostly parentheses, which are a bunch of legal cases, don't skip that. That's the most important one because those are all legal rules. So when you see a legal rule and then you see the citation, that's kind of what we're looking at for. The reasoning and the facts are less important than the legal rule. And I know that's, sounds crazy, but that's the fact, right? That's the truth. And this is because the facts might not fit. So you might start a case and it might seem like it's going to go one way. And then the judge says, but, we don't have a legal rule that applies to these facts. The judge counter opinion is kind of like that. It would make a great TV show, but the legal ruling is probably, more boring. Floyd versus New York, on the other hand, right, it does seem to follow the facts, right? But it's because it's so egregious, right? It's so crazy, the stop and frisk policy. Judge Downing, on the other hand, really starts off with the big broad principles and then starts working down to the legal rule and then applies the fact that basically, you couldn't come up with legal facts that would apply the rule that the other side is trying to use. And so, this is where somebody's trying to argue for a new rule and the judge says, the rule that exists is the one that should be applied. I probably said too much there because I really want you to, do this on your own. And so I gave you that format, right? You're trying to find the major premise, the rule, what's the big picture, and then try to find what's the minor thing, what's the conflict that's being debated, and then you want what's the conclusion, what's the result. Now, what you need to practice for your exam is explaining how you did that, right? So it's like in a math class where they say, explain your work or show your work. That's what you need to do. You might have to say something like, I think this is terrible. I want this to be this case, but I can't find a legal rule about it. And you might say something like, well, maybe global human rights would be the place to look because the United States is behind, let's say on the death penalty, for example. Regardless of what your political feelings are about the death penalty, there's only a handful of countries in the world that still have the death penalty. And so, one way of thinking about that argument would be looking at global human rights. Now, I did a video lecture that I'm going to announce, over in the announcements, Blackboard announcements, which should go to your email. It's long, but it really kind of talks about everything we talked about in class. So let's say you were to listen to that a couple times. I think you'd get into the habit and maybe do it right before you take the final exam. You'd be in the right mode of thought. Now, the zines, right? The zine project is really going back to those first readings and those first ideas that you came into the class with, right? You had ideas that weren't based on, course materials, right? They were based on your lived experience. Nothing wrong with it. So what you're seeing is the students going through that same struggle, right? They're trying to do the same thing you're doing. And so they selected information that they thought was relevant. But now you need to be trying to criticize a bit what they're doing, right? Not in a negative way, but saying like, well, how useful would this be to everyday people, and then see how can you be, that advocate then for the group that they're talking about the injustice, and that's what you're really thinking about. That's the process that you're thinking about when you write the letter to the judge on behalf of some community. And then the second part you want to think about is the symbol is just kind of my way of checking in to see that you're putting these pieces together. And if you struggle with the writing aspect, the symbol will kind of stand in and boost your grade a bit. And then finally, like just thinking about the final exam, these are the 10 questions that I think, if you're making flashcards or you want to practice writing out, and by all means, feel free to do that. You have to think about like, how do people get information about their rights that tells them that, they're going to be automatic, right? That if somebody violates your rights or if they harm you, then everything's going to be resolved. And then compare that to, the people who never get their cases resolved, who continue to suffer. So what's going on there? What's the gap? Think about the fact that those trained in law don't really think about these things, and they know how to activate their rights. They know how to use rights proactively so that they don't get harmed in the first place. So think about that gap between those who know the rules and those who are struggling to learn the rules. And then just remember that judges are well trained, largely disconnected from us ordinary folks. But through my own experience of going through legal education, it does help me understand how to use rules in a variety of different situations, and probably more often how to not get myself into trouble arguing based on passion and opinion when I don't actually have a legal basis to argue it. So then you want to try to make sure you're using the legal principles that come from the legal language of those cases. This is where I'm looking for you to quote, right? To quote directly to the cases. Tell me which case, include the page number, and show me that you're thinking like a judge. So I already explained in this presentation that judges, they put together a rules paragraph. It's got the rule, then it's got the citations. That's what I'm really looking for. So A students on your final exam, that's what you're going to do. B and C students, you're going to struggle to do that, but you're going to try to do it, right? You're going to try and get it through. And by B and C students, I mean that's just like the grade that you end up getting, not that you're already that thing. My fantasy is that you'll all get A's. And hopefully this helps you do that. So again, you're trying to quote directly to these cases. That's what I'm looking for. And then you have to start, explaining why you chose that rule. How does it apply to the injustice? And then think again about the different ways of thinking. So that will help you make sure that you're doing abduction instead of other ways of thinking or making arguments. And then finally, I've been working with other professors in our criminal justice program, and we've been thinking a lot about, students bring in a lot of information from popular culture, everyday resources, your uncle, blah, blah, blah. And it's a mixed bag, right? Some of that information is grounded in well-reasoned or research-based knowledge, and then others of it is, completely myth, stereotypes, etc. So we've been slowly kind of, trying to watch what you watch, learn what you are, what you're presenting, so that we can then take some of that information and present it back to you in a way that kind of does both, right? That says, okay, your lived experience is awesome, right? This is obviously much easier to teach you because you already know some things about this, but this thing, is a little off, right? We need to fix that a little bit. And maybe direct you in this other direction. And then occasionally, right, sometimes the stereotypes are just so far off that we have to say, whoa, this is not even remotely close to being accurate. And again, these aren't opinions, right? These are, like facts, like, whether you can bring a certain case in the Supreme Court, for example. That's not an opinion, right? There's well-established principle, and that's what we're really talking about in this kind of a class. And then I just want to remind you one more time, try to focus on the big picture here. The zine is your letter to the judge and your symbol is the most important part of your grade. And then consider doing the extra credit if you had any troubles earlier on in this class. And that's kind of, I think in a nutshell, right, what you'd need to do well in this class, and to clearly show me how you've learned from the course materials, and especially from the student zine projects because they did so much work in reducing, a large, huge amount of information into a couple slides or pictures, and you saw the different options. Okay, that's all I have to say.